So the issue of how to raise IQ, man, that's a killer. No one knows how to do it. I can tell you how to stop your IQ from decreasing as you get older. That's not so bad because it does that. Fluid IQ decreases from the time you're 20 and pretty rapidly. It's physical health is the best preventative. So exercise, physical exercise. Weirdly enough, you think, well, why? Well, your brain uses oxygen like mad, right? And it needs to be kept clean and well oxygenated. And physical exercise, both like weightlifting, so anaerobic and aerobic exercise, both seem to be very, very effective at staving off cognitive declines across the lifespan. So that's a really useful thing to know because that's the only thing we know that does that. So then the next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, so, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value.
You might say, well, how do you discover the purpose of your life? Okay, so there's a variety of ways to approach that. You could say, well, you can look at what interests you. Okay, so some things call to you, you find them compelling and engaging. You have to watch yourself and see what those things are, and you can pursue them. And so that's positive emotion pulling you forward. But then there's a regulatory mechanism that goes along with that, which is something like your conscience. And so your conscience is like the voice of negative emotion, and it tells you when you're wandering off the beaten path towards your destination. And what would you say? It informs you with guilt and shame about the inadequacies of your behavior. But you can also use that as a way of discovering your purpose or your destiny, because virtually everyone, imagine there are things you're interested in, but there are also things that bother you. There are things that show up to you like they're a problem and they bother you. And you might say, well, I don't want to have any problems, and that's not a very good way of looking at it. What you should understand is that those things bother you because they happen to be your problems. And so you could find your purpose in their solution.
Why can you teach children with stories? If you get the story right for a child, you can capture the child's interest and you can integrate almost any form of learning into the story. And the child will be captivated by that. When children play, pretend play, which they do spontaneously, they spontaneously dramatize the world. They spontaneously make stories out of their roles and their destinies. And that captures them. That forms the basis of their friendships. That's why children want to play so frenetically, is that they're practicing modeling the world. When you go see a movie, it's not that you want to be entertained, although it is entertaining. That's not why you're there. It's not for fun either. That's easy to understand and to see. What's fun about a horror movie? I'm dead serious. It's like people will be so afraid in a horror movie that they'll cover their eyes. They'll hide behind the chair in front of them. They'll ask themselves afterwards why they even put themselves through it. And yet they'll line up and pay to do it. Well, why would you line up and pay to torture yourself? Well, because you want to know how to deal with what's horrifying. And you want to practice that in a way, if you can, that isn't in itself fatal. You want to expose yourself to the catastrophes of existence so that you're prepared when those catastrophes come along. You want to expose yourself to the predators that lurk everywhere. You want to inure yourself against what's disgusting and contaminating because you're going to have to deal with it. You want to expose yourself to what's frightening so that you can find the courage within you to deal with what's frightening. And that's part of the instinct to develop and expand your competence. And it's in that expansion of competence and skill that occurs as a consequence of that voluntary exposure that the entertainment is situated. The reason that's entertaining is because it's part of the manner in which you expand yourself. And you can do that in the direction of what's dark and terrible, just as you can in the direction of, say, what's heroic. What do you do when you go to a movie? Well, you fasten onto a character, and you understand that character the same way that you understand people that you're in conversation with. Now, you might think that the way that you understand people is by you listen to what they say and you extract out the knowledge that they're delivering to you in terms of facts, and you interpret the facts and you derive your understanding of the person. Like, none of that's true. That has absolutely nothing to do with how you establish a relationship with someone. And, well, here's some proof. Is that what you do with a dog? Well, obviously not, but you can establish a relationship with a dog. And the relationship you have with a dog, it's not the same as the relationship with a person, but a dog's a pack animal. A dog can become a member of the family. You can understand a dog well enough so the dog likes you. Right, and so whatever you're doing with the dog, it isn't discourse about propositions, because most of the dogs you own don't talk. So, and it's the same with very young children, and it's the same with an infant. You establish a relationship using mechanisms that aren't propositional. They're not rules, they're not descriptions, they're not facts. That's not how you do it. How do you do it? Where do you look when you talk to someone? You look at their eyes. Why? To see where they're pointing them. Why? So you can see what they're looking at. Why? So you can infer what's important to them, because we point our eyes at that which is important to us. That's why our eyes look the way they look. Black in the middle, colored on the ring around that against a white background. That's an evolved mechanism. I can see your eyes. All of our ancestors whose eyes weren't visible either got killed or didn't reproduce. The one thing you want to know about someone right away is where the hell their eyes are pointed. And you can do that politely, which you do by attending to someone without too predatory a stare. You do that by attending politely to their face, but not too intensely, and not attending, let's say, inappropriately to other parts of their body. And they're going to be watching you to see what you do with your eyes. Because the one thing you want to know about someone, above all else, is what the hell are they up to? Right? What's their aim? And so, when you go to a movie, that's what you do. When you watch a character in a role, you see him in a variety of different situations. And you watch how he structures his attention, what he pays attention to, because attention is a costly business. And so people pay attention to what they value. You watch what they attend to, and you watch how they prioritize their actions. And from that, you derive an understanding of what's important to them. As soon as you understand what's important to them, you've got their aim. You've figured that character out. This is what you do when you learn to know someone. What's their aim? As soon as you know their aim, you can see the world through their eyes. You can see the same objects they see, and the objects take on the same emotional significance. And when you say, I come to understand someone, what you really mean is, oh, I understand their aim, and now I can aim at the same thing, at least in simulation, at least fictionally, and I can come to inhabit the same world of perception and emotion that they inhabit. I can even guess at how they might act and to what they might attend in situations I haven't seen, because now I know their aim. What's he up to? That's what you're thinking in a murder mystery or in a thriller. What's he up to? What's he up to? What's going to happen next? And so the plot of the fiction is the aim of the character across time, the aim as the character unfolds. And that might involve the transformation of his aims as well, right? And that would be the transformation of a character in a movie. He aims at one thing and he learns that that aim is off in some manner, or he comes to a bitter and dismal partial end and has to switch course. And you want to see people transform their aims. That's character development. We see the world through a story. Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the microprocesses associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. The world's objects reveal themselves in relationship to our aim. The landscape of emotion presents itself as markers on the pathway to our aim. The world reveals itself in accordance with our aim. That's how perception works. That's a hell of a thing to learn. Because if the world, for example, appears to you only as thorn-bearing obstacles, right? If you feel that everything's arrayed against you and there's no pathway forward, if you feel that you're surrounded by foes and obstacles instead of walking the golden pathway, accompanied by allies with the world on your side, you might ask yourself whether or not your aim is wrong. And so, the world lays itself out in accordance with our aim. We produce fiction, we generate fiction, we live in a fictional landscape because we want to get our aim right. We read stories, we watch movies, we go to plays, we talk to each other because we want to get our aim right. We want to find the place we should go, and we want to learn how to get there efficiently. And we're compelled by spirit and instinct to establish the aim and follow the path, and to transform ourselves so that our aim becomes ever more precise and efficient and delivers us a world that's ever more abundant and beautiful. And that's all a function of aim. Okay, so now I'm going to go from this side of the room to the other side, and that's my little journey. And so, but that isn't exactly how journeys work. They're nested. You've seen bullseyes, classical arrow, archery bullseyes. I think they're red in the middle usually, right? And then there's a variety of colored circles around them. Maybe the whole bullseye is this big, and you're supposed to hit the bullseye, but the closer you get to the center, the better. But at least you could hit part of it. That would be good, And you're supposed to stand back and pull your arrow back and aim. And that's an acting out of something. It's an acting out of the necessity of having an aim and taking your best shot, right? That's what makes it a sport. Now, and if you think about that, most of our sports are like that, right? Soccer's like that. Rugby's like that, basketball's like that, hockey's like that. Almost all team sports involve some sort of projectile going to some sort of target. And usually people organize themselves into hierarchies, 2 of them, because there's 2 teams, and then they compete and cooperate to get the projectile in the target. And for some reason, we think that's really cool. Right? Well, look, it's worth thinking through deeply. It's like you'll spend a lot of money on that opportunity to go. In Toronto, you can't buy NHL tickets for the Maple Leafs. They're unbelievably expensive, and they've been sold out forever, even though the damn team hasn't won a championship since like 1968. Doesn't matter. People will spend a fortune to go sit in an arena like a long way away from the action, and there's these guys out there, and they're tough and they're fast, and they're fighting with this little black frozen disc, and they're trying to get it in a net while someone is trying to stop. It's completely bloody absurd, and yet people are thrilled about it. They're thrilled, and they'll pay for it, right? They don't have to be dragged there kicking and screaming. Like, they line up. It's, oh God, a hockey game. Thank God. And they'll wear the jerseys. It's like, and then, some character who's put in his $10,000 does his beautiful move and puts in a goal in some manner that's like technically impossible, and everybody leaps to their feet and they just have a fit of joy. And you think, what in the world is going on with that? It's like you're happier when that happens than you were when you got married. It's like you don't see people doing that when they're, and it's not everybody, when you get married and everybody stands up and has a little like a 10-minute fit and hugs strangers and then goes out and drinks a dozen beer and has a riot and tears down stores. It's like, no, but a good goal, that'll do it. I think Guatemala and Ecuador went to war over a soccer game, literally. So, and let's not assume we're so stupid, even though we are. Let's not assume it. There's something behind this. It's like, we really like to see people take careful aim and hit the target. And we really like to see them cooperate and compete in an expert manner to do that. And we really like to see them do that in a way that stretches their ability beyond what we would normally be able to see, right? Because it's nice to go to a competent display of athletics, but now and then you see these like soccer goals on YouTube where these crazy characters, they flip around in the air and they're like 8 feet off the ground, completely backwards, and they kick the ball 4 feet to the side of the goalie. It's just impossible. Like they're 100 yards away and it's perfect. And you think, right on. That's what a human being is like. And you're not really like that because you couldn't do it, but you are human, and conceivably you could do something like that. And so it's a nice display of that potential for us to hit the damn target, right? So then the question is, well, what's the target? And that's the question, because that's the same question as what's the meaning? And so, okay, so here's my target, let's say. Do a personal unpacking of my value system, at least in part. So I'm a writer, and I'm a writer and a researcher and a clinician, and a professor. So those things, in maybe roughly in that order. And so that's my claim to my position in the social hierarchy. And the claim is something like, I'm competent at that, it's worthwhile, therefore I'm reasonably entitled by the rules of the game to the privileges and statuses that are associated with that position, right? As long as I'm competent. So there's a match between social demand and my ability, and as long as I'm playing the game properly, then I'm safe. That's what's keeping my emotions regulated. It's not my internal regulation. It's the fact that I can do what I say I can do, and everyone else agrees, and people value that, and that keeps me secure. That's also why I don't want too much social upheaval, because I might end up with the same skill set in a society that doesn't value those skills, and then what? Then I'm done. So I want there to be an isomorphism between my internal hierarchy of perceptual value and the social structure itself. And so this is also partly why radical claims of multiculturalism are wrong, because at the base of things, we need to be playing a unified game so that everybody knows what everybody else is up to. Doesn't mean that diversity of opinion isn't useful, because now and then the collective claim is going to be wrong and need to be updated. And so you need some strange people around, creative people, generally speaking, who will, take things in a direction that's novel to update. But roughly speaking, we want everybody nested in the same game, and then maybe above that playing some different games. And we need that, because it's the only way we can orient ourselves in the world. It's the only way we can keep a match between our expectations and our skills and our desires and what's actually expected of us in the world. There's nothing that's more harmful than for you to play the game straight, right? To do what you're supposed to do, to be a good person, and then to be punished for it instead of rewarded. Very disheartening. You want what you think to be good and right to also be rewarded by the world in that manner. And that means the structures have to be, the social structure and the psychological structure have to match. And part of the reason that we protect our cultures is so that we can protect the match between our psychological structures and our social structures and keep ourselves oriented, moving forward in the world with some positive emotion and not terrified out of our skulls. It's crucially important. It's why we'll fight to protect what we've built. It's the game we understand. And it's not something that can just be arbitrarily shifted or changed. And that's partly because the aim isn't arbitrary. The aim isn't arbitrary. This is the problem with the postmodernists and the moral relativists. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. They're 100 years out of date. They've got it wrong. Okay, so I'm typing. And when I'm typing, I'm moving my fingers, right? And that's not thinking. That's moving my fingers. And I don't really know how I move my fingers, but I can do it. And I can do it on a keyboard. And so I can type letters one at a time. And so you might say, well, what are you doing if you were watching me? And I'd say, well, I'm typing letters. That's my aim. So I'm pretty happy when I hit an A and an A appears, and I'm not that happy when I hit an A and an E appears and I have to backspace. A little annoyance there, right? Because I've shifted off the target. A little frustration. I fix it. That's okay. Back on track. But I'm not typing letters, because like, who wants to read a bunch of letters? No one. You want to read words. So I'm trying to organize the letters into words. So goal 1 is the letters, nested inside goal 2, which is the words. But you don't want just random words. That's not helpful. How about some phrases? That'd be good. How about some sentences? Letters, words, phrases, sentences. Now we're starting to get into units of meaning, right? And those are directions. They're like a map. They have a point. Like a book has a point. Like a story has a point. And the point is to outline the map properly. And then not just sentences, paragraphs. And those are organizations of sentences that make the sentences make sense, and the phrases, and the words, and the letters, all nested together. And not just paragraphs, chapters, right? And then chapters nested in a whole book. And then not just the whole bloody book, because that's not enough. The book itself has to be nested in the shared literary experience of the audience. I have to assume, if I'm writing a book, that there's a certain amount of culture that we share. Because otherwise I'd have to explain absolutely everything about absolutely everything, and I can't. And so the book doesn't work unless it's in a culture that's composed of maybe 1,000 books in some sense that are widely known by all of us, even if we haven't read them. I can assume that the reader is a mechanism that can understand what I've written, and that's part of where the meaning is too. And so that's all nested together, all of that, to make it meaningful for me to sit down in the morning and concentrate so foolishly in some sense on moving my fingers up and down on a keyboard. Right? What's meaningful about that? Well, nothing. Who cares if I type a letter? A single letter. Yeah, well, how about a word? How about the right word? How about the right phrase? How about the right sentence? Well, every movement outward, more broadly, makes it more meaningful. And if that whole structure is coherent, then all of the small actions become associated with the meaning of all of the large-scale actions, right? I'm not just typing letters. I'm writing a book. Why? Okay, then we get broader. This is the bullseye. This is the structure of the bullseye. The center might be the letter, you know? That's one way of looking at it. That's the highest resolution thing. I got to get that exactly right. And then it's nested inside all of these other structures. Well, I'm an educator. Okay, so I'm hoping the book will be educational. Well, why? Well, because maybe it would be better for people to be educated than not to be, so that they don't have to suffer so stupidly, and so they could be less malevolent, and that the world would be a less brutal place. That would be all right. So that's part of my goal. I'm a clinician. I want to fulfill that part of my moral obligation to justify my privileged position in the social hierarchy, right? I'm a scientist. I want to test my hypothesis and see if they're correct so I can advance the scientific domain and push human knowledge a little bit farther out into the unknown, right? And I'm doing that maybe because I want to be a good person, something like that. Okay, so now we're a long ways out in the moral hierarchy. And so now we might think about, well, what does it mean to be a good person? Does that mean something? Well, you think it does. Because you know people who are good people, and you know people who aren't good people, and you make a qualitative distinction between them, and you know when you're being a good person, and when you're not, and you make a qualitative distinction between that too. So I don't think we have to have a discussion about whether or not good and bad people exist. We might have a discussion about how you distinguish between them, but that's a different issue. So here's some ideas, and this is what we'll end off with. What does a good person do? They take care of themselves. That's a good thing, you know. You don't want to be a burden to anyone else. Sometimes you're going to have to be, but most of the time, maybe it'd be better if you were a net positive, you know, and rely on people when you have to. And so that means don't be so damn useless and constrain some of your malevolence. And that's a good, meaty, bloody war to get involved in. It's not trivial. It gives you something to do when you get up in the morning. And then it might be the same with your social organization, your family. It's like your family could use some work, man. Just like everybody's family, and you might be able to help. And the company you work for, same thing. Blind, willfully blind, stupid, corrupt, going in the wrong direction. Not entirely. You know, I mean, things work pretty well for how haphazard the world is in some sense. I'm not trying to be overly pessimistic, and I'm certainly not claiming that we live in an oppressive patriarchy, but like there's work to do in most organizations. A little honesty and a little hard work on your part might straighten that thing out just a little bit, and God only knows what the consequences of that would be across time. And then, you know, there's natural worries that you might want to take care of. There's diseases to conquer, and there's children to take care of, and there's food to provide, and all of the things that go along with that, so that you could involve yourself in taming and regulating the natural world, and that would be a good thing. So there's three sources of meaning, right? Get yourself under control. See what you can do about the tyranny of culture, and see what you can do about the civilization of nature, right? That's the construction of a walled garden. That's what paradise means, to get the balance between civilization and nature right. That's your goal, so people can live in there in peace and harmony, including you. That's a good goal. And then you think, well, that's going out quite a ways, you know? You're the culture hero who's taking on your own malevolence and ignorance, the tyranny of your culture and the cruelty of nature. Great. We need more people like you. Go for it. And then maybe we can go one stage outside of that. And this is as far as I can go with it. So here's how I think we are. You know, you hear scientists talk about us as deterministic creatures. We're causal, like an alarm clock. You wind the thing up. Of course, you don't anymore. But you wind the thing up and it just ticks away, and one thing follows another. It's like, we're actually not like that. You build systems of habit. So here's an example. If I go like this, that's a ballistic movement. And I have to plan that movement from here to here before I execute it, because the movement is so fast that I can't get a neural message from my hand to my brain and back to stop it once it's started. So the whole thing is deterministic. I plan it, let it go, it's deterministic. But I know how to do this. It's habit. I have a structure built in me that's deterministic. And lots of things you do are like that. Habit. Anything you practice enough, it's habit. So you're deterministic at the habit level, but you're not deterministic at the level of consciousness. Because consciousness comes into play when you're doing something that you haven't done before. And so that's interesting, because what it means is the conscious you is dealing with the world that isn't determined yet. And I would say it's actually dealing with the world of possibility, the world of potential. And it's a world we believe in. You say to people, you're not living up to your potential. And you say that to yourself too, you know, when you wake up at night and you're guilty. I'm not living up to my potential. And you don't feel good about that. And you think, well, there's potential around you that you're not exploiting. You know, and you feel bad about that too. And you should. And so it's a good source of guilt and shame. Not enough to crush you maybe, but enough to wake you up. And it's certainly not something you hope for the people that you love. It's okay. You're wasting your potential. It doesn't matter. It's like no one says that. And so we're contending with potential. And we know that because we wake up in the morning and poof, we're awake. Like the sun has risen again. We're awake. And we confront the world. And what do we confront? We confront the possibilities, the potential, and the horror of the day. Here's the things we could do. Here's the things that could go bad. Here's how we could make things go better. And you know what that is. It's usually, There's 3 or 4 things that I need to do today that I'd rather avoid. But I better do them because if I don't do them, the world will be a worse place by 6 o'clock tonight. Right? And that's a funny thing because the world isn't like that yet. It isn't made like that yet. It won't be made like that until you make it. And you might think, well, here's some things I could do that would be good, that would actually make the world a better place by 6 o'clock tonight. Take some effort, and the willingness and some aim, but you could do that. You could make it slightly better than it was, and certainly slightly less worse than it could be. And you know that, it weighs on you, I would say, as soon as you wake up. It might be a moral burden, or it might be excitement, or it might be some combination of both. But that's certainly how you view yourself. A conscious agent, confronting what has not yet been brought into being, confronting potential, and determining the course that the world's going to take. Maybe just in your small area, but who knows how big your area is and how much what you do echoes around you. We have an idea in our culture that each of us is the center of the world. That's why you're part of the sovereign state. That's why you vote. That's why the future of the state itself is dependent on your decision. Because we've decided over like a 10,000-year period that you're king. You, for whatever reasons, it's on you. Your conscious ability to be awake and to be articulate and to be clued in and to keep nature at bay and culture straight and your own malevolence under check and to combat the unknown and to transform it into something that's good. That's what you are. And you see this reflected in the oldest stories. That's the dragon myth, You go out into the terrible unknown, beyond what we understand, into the unknown itself. And you confront the terrible thing that rests there. The terrible eternal predatory monster. And you can do that because that's what you're like. You're not cowering at home. You're not frozen into submission. You're out there active and you can take it on. And as a consequence, you can attain something of substantive value, right? And that's you. That's the transformation of you because now you're braver because you've done it. But it's also something now that you've garnered from the potential. And you can bring that back and you can distribute that into the community. That's the story of humanity. It's the oldest story we have, and it's correct.
You might say, well, how do you discover the purpose of your life? Okay, so there's a variety of ways to approach that. You could say, well, you can look at what interests you. Okay, so some things call to you. You find them compelling and engaging. You have to watch yourself and see what those things are, and you can pursue them. And so that's positive emotion pulling you forward. But then there's a regulatory mechanism that goes along with that, which is something like your conscience. And so your conscience is like the voice of negative emotion, and it tells you when you're wandering off the beaten path towards your destination. And it informs you with guilt and shame about the inadequacies of your behavior. But you can also use that as a way of discovering your purpose or your destiny, because virtually everyone, imagine there are things you're interested in, but there are also things that bother you. There are things that show up to you like they're a problem and they bother you. And you might say, well, I don't want to have any problems, and that's not a very good way of looking at it. What you should understand is that those things bother you because they happen to be your problems. And so you could find your purpose in their solution. And that's the call of conscience. And in classic religious writings, in the biblical narratives, for example, one of the conceptualizations of God that's very common is the interplay between calling and conscience. And so one of the things we're going to do with Peterson Academy, we're doing this with this essay program as well, is help people discover their calling and help them establish a relationship with their conscience. Now we've differentiated, we are and have differentiated that to some degree too, because what you're interested in and what bothers you is going to be dependent to some degree on your personality structure. And we know how to map that. We know how to turn that into questions that you could write about or investigate. And it's also going to be dependent to some degree on the structure of interest per se. So psychologists have broken the world of what you're interested in into its appropriate statistical domains. So for example, engineers have interests in the realistic domain. it's more practical. And there are people who are more interested in the aesthetic domain. There's a model called RIASEC, R-I-A-S-E-C. It provides a 6-dimensional overview of interest. And so we're going to use those technologies to help people understand what they're interested in, why. That can help them pick topics to write about and to investigate, but it also helps them chart a course, let's say, for their life.
To do with my life. I feel so lost. And I've kind of felt like that too, and I felt the best thing to do is you got to leave your hometown for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And make yourself uncomfortable, and that's the best thing you can do. I don't know how you feel about that.
Socially, for sure, like you said, that definitely helps a lot.
Well, there's a story, I read about this in this book, We Who Wrestle with God. So the story of Abraham was a foundational story, right? Because Abraham founds the Abrahamic religions, which is a big contribution. Abraham is really the first individual in the biblical stories. And his story is, you could think about it as the archetypal story of the individual. So what happens to Abraham at the beginning of the story is he's wealthy. So he has everything he could want in life if you thought about life as just a set of needs and wants. So his parents are wealthy. He spends 70 years in his dad's encampment, in his tent, being taken care of. And the divine comes to him as the voice of adventure. And it says to him, you have to leave your zone of comfort. And you have to go out into the world and have the difficult adventure of your life, and that will be better.
You can watch The Simpsons, or you can watch South Park, and South Park has like the world's worst animation, right? I mean, everything moves like this, it's all circles and triangles, and you don't care. It's like 5 minutes into the narrative, it doesn't matter that it's circles and triangles having a conversation. It's fine. The icon will work. And that's a good rule for perception, is you use the simplest possible perceptual scheme that you can manage to get yourself from point A to point B, right? It's a map. You don't see the world. You see an iconic representation of the world. And then the question is, what makes the iconic representation sufficient? And I suppose sufficient means a couple of things. One thing it means is tolerable, right? It doesn't cause an excess of suffering and degeneration. It has to be functional, right? And then maybe a more specific example of that would be, well, it has to work, like a map works. A map is a low-resolution representation, but it's a good enough map if you use the map and you start at point A and you happen to be at point A, which is a good beginning for a map, and then you use the map and you get to point B and you think, good enough map. And that's really, that's us. That's how we think. That's how we construe the world. Our maps are really, the stories that we use in the world are really the maps we use to guide us. And they have perceptual implications, but that's essentially what you do. So now the question is, all right, what happened in the gorilla video? Well, what happened was you were aiming at something, right? You were aiming at counting the passes. And the question is, well, why were you doing that? And the answer is, well, someone told you to, asked you to. And then you might ask, well, why did you listen to them? There's lots of other things you might have done in the lab, but that isn't what you did. You did what you were asked to. And we might say, well, that's because you're reasonably cooperative and civilized. And then we might say, well, why is that a hallmark of cooperation and civilization? And we might say, well, reciprocity, like spontaneous reciprocity between strangers who have a bit of a contractual arrangement is part of civilized behavior, and so that's the appropriate thing to do. And we might say, well, you wanted to do a good job in the lab because you wanted to make sure that your status wasn't too low. You know, you could count to 16, and so you can give yourself a pat on the back of the head for that. And, you know, it's part of being a civilized person. And so there's a huge value structure behind that. Like, you didn't go into the lab and shoot it up, you know? You didn't bring a hand grenade, right? And you didn't sexually assault the experimenter. There's lots of things you could have done in there, and you didn't do those things. You just sat there and counted the balls and missed the gorilla. Okay, so, and there's complicated reasons for that. There are deep reasons for that. And so there are deep reasons for how you perceive things and why. And so that's what we're going to go into. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the basics of perception. And perception is very, very tightly related to action, to movement forward, and to emotion. and those things are very important to know. They're very tightly associated. So for example, you live in a map, let's say, or a story, and the story is wherever I am isn't as good as it could be, and so I'm going to go somewhere that's somewhat better. And you know, that can be of different time frames. Maybe you've got a plan for the next minute. You know, you're hungry, and so you want to go somewhere to eat, or maybe it could be for the next hour, or the next week, or the next day, or the next year, or whatever. But basically what you're trying to do is take where you are, point A, and make it better, point B. And so you're always somewhere that isn't quite as good as it should be, and you're always going somewhere that's somewhat better. At least that's the hope. Unless things have gone wrong, you know, and you feel, God, it's nothing but downhill from here on in. And that's not good. You don't want that. That's a pathological condition. So, and it's kind of unfortunate in some sense because it means you can't be satisfied with what you've got. But how the hell can you be satisfied with what you've got? Because you've got problems coming your way. You know, I mean, even if everything's okay right now, which it probably isn't, but even if it was, that doesn't mean everything's going to be okay tomorrow or next week or next year or 5 years from now, right? You've got the future to take care of and your future self, and you've got your family to take care of, and maybe you've got your community to take care of. So you've got some problems. And so the way things are isn't good enough. And so you're going to fix them a bit. And so then you fix them across different levels of resolution. And you do this, technically in this manner. So you identify where you are. One thing you might think about is if you're mixed up, one of the problems you might have is that you don't know where you are. Lots of times people have to go to therapy or talk for a long time to someone to find out where they are, because your experience might have scattered you everywhere, and you feel that that you've come apart at the seams, right? That things have fallen apart around you, that you're in chaos. You don't know where you are, and so then you're in trouble, because how the hell are you going to plot a course forward into the future if you don't know where you are? And so maybe you have to bring yourself up to date. I have an exercise online, by the way, at a place called Self-Authoring, which is called the Past Authoring Exercise, fittingly enough. And what it asks you to do is to write an autobiography. It's a guided autobiography, and it can kind of bring you up to date. And you can know if you need to be brought up to date. It's fairly straightforward. If you're obsessed by memories of the past, more than 18 months old, and most of those are negative, so anxiety-provoking most often, then there's a lot of you that's stuck in the past. And what that means is you didn't map the territory well enough, and the parts of your brain that are alarm systems, anxiety systems, are saying, no, there's holes in the way you're looking at the world. There's holes in the way that you're looking in the world. And you fell in them once, and you don't know where they are, and you don't know how to fill them, and you don't know how to walk around them, and so you can't forget them, you can't forget them, you can't forget them, you can't forget them. So you have recurring nightmares, for example, are a good example of that sort of thing happening. But in any case, if you have memories like that, you remember them, they make you feel anxious and negative, you're stuck back there. Your body is still reacting as if there's an emergency that could happen again that you haven't fixed. And it doesn't matter if it was your fault. That's irrelevant, because the alarm system doesn't care. Like, when your smoke detector goes off, it isn't relevant whether it was your fault. The smoke detector just says, house is on fire. And that's a bad thing. And your anxiety systems are like that. If they're tagging old memories with anxiety, then you have to do something about it, or you will be tortured by those memories forever, because that's how the alarm system works. And so maybe you need to go back there and clean things up. You've got to figure out, okay, well, how did this happen? What sort of role did I play? Even if it's a minor role, that doesn't matter, because the point is that you don't want to be put in the same vulnerable position again. So anything you can do to strengthen yourself is good. You know, and often if it's a really old memory, like maybe you were a child, you're not a child now, so you probably have a variety of techniques at hand that you could use to deal with a situation like that if it came up now. And so you have to update that part of your brain that still thinks you're 4. And lots of people have parts of them that are still stuck in some traumatic childhood experience. And they don't. I had a friend like that who had a terrible childhood, and I mean really. I've had clients with terrible childhoods, and his was like top of the lobster hierarchy in terms of terrible childhoods. And whenever he had a dream about it, which was very often, he was 5 in his dream. Well, he's 58. You know, he's not 5, but hadn't been updated, and so he was still 5 in his dreams, and it was a complete bloody nightmares for him, complete with all sorts of terrible physiological symptoms, really hurting his life. He couldn't get himself updated, and he's much older in his dreams now, by the way. He's up to about 45, so which is way better than 5, you know, because you can't fight back when you're 5, but you can fight back when you're 45, especially if you have some, you know, some experience at your disposal. So anyways, you need to know where you are. So let's say where you are is, well, you're on this stage, and you're on this side of the stage, and you decide that you're going to go over to that side of the stage, just to show that you can. And you're making the decision, the same decision that, you know, the famous chicken who is going to cross the road. Why does the chicken cross the road? Well, if it's a sensible chicken, it's because it assumes that there's something better on the other side of the road. It's like, or maybe it's random curiosity, but then it just gets picked off by a dingo or a coyote, so that's not so good. The other side of the road is better, so away the chicken goes. So that's what you're doing. You're going somewhere slightly better. And so that's good. Technically, it's good. Because the way that your positive emotion systems work, they run on a neurochemical called dopamine, which, by the way, is the neurochemical system that drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine and alcohol for some people and opiates affect dramatically and make people feel far better than they should, which is part of their danger. It's a very fundamental system. The dopamine system kicks in with a kick of positive emotion if you're going somewhere that's worth going. And so that's worth knowing. It's really worth knowing. It's like, okay, you want a little bit of positivity in your life. Well, how do you get it? Well, you've got to get the system. It's almost it's the left hemisphere system for most people. Not that that's particularly relevant, but it is a standalone neurochemical system. It's rooted very, very deeply in the brain's exploratory circuitry. So very ancient system. And it's happy when you have somewhere to go. That's the first thing. And then it's also happy when you're going there. And so if I'm on this side of the stage, and I want to go over to that side of the stage, and I see that there's a nice clear pathway, I could just go straight down this line, then I look at that, and I'm actually a little happy. I'm not ecstatic. I mean, who the hell cares if I get to the other side of the stage, right? I mean, it's a small piece of my life, but it's not nothing. It's something. Okay, and so I look at the pathway, and I think that's a good pathway, and I feel a little positive. And then if I move here, and then I see that little table right in the way between me and the other side of the stage, then I feel a little negative, because I don't want an obstacle in my pathway. And so that's really how you're looking at the world, by the way. You don't see objects. It's not the right way to think about it. We don't see objects, and then think about them, and then evaluate them, and then decide how to act on them. Or if we do it rarely and slowly and with a lot of thought. What we see instead are pathways with tools that will move us forward, or obstacles, right? And there's no obstacles here, and there's a nice flat road, and so great. Positive emotion. This is a task I can undertake. The sailing is clear. It's a good day. And then I'm here, and it's like, yeah, well, that's a little annoying. I get a little pang of disappointment, let's say, anxiety. Can I make it around that obstacle? I'm fairly confident. I've done this sort of thing before. So I can take the rough route, and I can, walk forward like this, and then I can do this great trick, which is just this, and then, I've circumvented the obstacle. Now, if I didn't know how to do the little bit of circumvention, then that would be a real problem, right? Because I couldn't get from point A to B, and that would screw up my plan. But I do have that particular skill set, so it's a minor disruption to the perceptual set that I'm using to organize the world. It's a minor bit of chaos, because that's what happens when your perceptual set, the structure that you're using to organize the world, the plan through which you're viewing the complexity of the world, reveals an inadequacy. Then that destabilizes your emotions. So that's another thing to know. One thing you need to know is you need to be going somewhere, and there needs to be a pathway in order for you to feel good. The other thing to know is that if that plan is untenable or becomes destabilized, then what happens is you become flooded with negative emotion. Frustration, disappointment, anger, primarily anxiety. But all of those things sort of intermingled. Anger maybe because you have to fight your way through the obstacle. Frustration because maybe you have to make a new plan. Disappointment because you put a bunch of work into the damn plan and it didn't work out. Anxiety because now there's too many choices in front of you. And so people don't like to have their plans disrupted. They don't like to have their plans disrupted. And the reason for that is that their plans are directly associated with their emotional perception of the world. And so, that's a good thing to know too. That's why, you know, what it is you've decided that you're going to go to like a Korean restaurant for dinner, and that's fine, and then it turns out that you can't, and maybe you have to go to a Greek restaurant, and it's like, who cares, right? Unless you hate Greek restaurants. Korean restaurant, that's pretty good. Greek restaurant, that's pretty good. You're still going to be annoyed that your plans changed. Well, why? Well, because it's annoying to have your plans changed. It disrupts the structure that you use to stabilize your perceptions of the world. And it throws you momentarily into a state of chaos. Not much. Now, how much chaos? This is interesting. We don't know. You know, like, let's say you wake up one morning and you have an ache in your side. It's like, well, you don't have an ache in your side. What does it mean that you have an ache in your side? Well, you don't know. Like, maybe it means you pulled a muscle, and like, who the hell cares? Maybe it means you have cancer, and like, you're going to be dead in 6 months. The whole range of possibility is there, you know, and some people will assume one thing, it's like, that's nothing, and some people will assume the other, and all of them will be right sometime. And so the question is, how do you calibrate something like that? And the answer is, well, we tend to guess at it. We guess at it temperamentally. So one way we guess at it is we have our set points for negative emotion. So it's neuroticism, trait. Some people will be a lot more nervous about a small level anomaly than others. And maybe they'll go to the hospital first and they won't die. And then, or maybe they'll be freaking out all the time and they'll be a hypochondriac, right? So there's pros and cons about being nervous like that. The other person's very emotionally stable. They don't worry about much. They think, it's nothing. And then, you know, by the time they get to the hospital, it's too late. Hey, that's how the dice roll. That's one way that you guess. It's determined in large part genetically. Not completely, but in large part. Another part is your position in the hierarchy. You know, so the issue is, well, how safe are you in life? And the answer is, who knows? But one of the way you guess is, well, are you good at things? You know, because if you're good at things and a problem comes up, you can probably solve it. And then you might think, well, how do you know if you're good at things? And one answer might be, well, other people think you're good at things. Because you're really kind of comparing yourself to other people when you're thinking about whether or not you're good at things. And so if it turns out that you're in a hierarchy and you're fairly high in the hierarchy, indicating a certain degree of competence, then your nervous system, under the control of the serotonin system, dampens down your negative emotion. It says, look, you know, all things considered, you're probably pretty safe. And that's nice, but it also means you don't like having your position in the dominance hierarchy challenged at all. Because if you get tossed down the hierarchy, let's say you get fired, well, it wreaks havoc with your serotonergic function. It makes you defeated, like the defeated lobsters that I wrote about. And then all of a sudden, you're way more susceptible to negative emotion. And who wants that? And so that's why you don't even like to lose arguments. You know, you lose a little argument, it's like, whoop, down the dominance hierarchy a bit, up, emotions are a bit destabilized. It's no damn way, I'm right. And why? Because I want to keep my neurochemistry in check. And no wonder. Well, the thing is, sometimes it's better to learn than to insist upon being right, because learning works better for the future. But you get the point.
See, I get DMs all the time. I hear people just like they're at that 23, 26 age. They're
Yeah.
like, dude, I don't know what the hell to do with my life. I feel so lost. And I've kind of felt like that too. And I felt the best thing to do is you got to leave your hometown for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And make yourself uncomfortable. And that's the best thing you can do. I don't know how you feel about that.
Socially, for
Yeah.
sure, like you said, that definitely helps a lot.
Well, there's a story that I read about this in this book, We Who Wrestle with God. So the story of Abraham was a foundational story, right? Because Abraham founds the Abrahamic religions, which is a big contribution. Abraham is really the first individual in the biblical stories. And his story is, you could think about it as the archetypal story of the individual. So what happens to Abraham at the beginning of the story is he's wealthy. So he has everything he could want in life if you thought about life as just a set of needs and wants. So his parents are wealthy. He spends 70 years in his dad's encampment, in his tent, being taken care of. And the divine comes to him as the voice of adventure. And it says to him, you have to leave your zone of comfort. And you have to go out into the world and have the difficult adventure of your life. And that will be better than just having everything handed to you on a silver platter, which is it's an interesting way of looking at it, that life is for adventure rather than comfort. And God, who's the voice of adventure, makes Abraham an offer. It's a very interesting offer. It's very much worth thinking about. So the voice of adventure pulls Abraham into his quest, let's say, tells him that if you follow the spirit of adventure, here's what will happen to you. You'll become a blessing to yourself. So you'll live a life that you find worth living. So that's a good reward. You'll do that in a way that will enhance your reputation among other people validly. So that's a good thing, because one of the basic drives, let's say, of anybody who's reasonably socialized is to do something that is useful and that other people regard as useful. And then the next offer is you'll do that in a way that will increase the probability that you'll establish something permanent. So that's a good deal, because people would like, generally, when they think about having a meaningful life, they think about maybe doing something of lasting significance. And the fourth offer is, and you'll do it in a way that'll be a benefit to everyone else. It's such a beautiful story, because it's such a cool story, because it makes this case that the same force that compels you out into the world, even as a child, if it's made fully manifest and you leave your hometown, you leave your zone of comfort, and you allow yourself to develop, is that you'll have the life that you want. Your name will grow among other people. You'll establish something permanent, and you'll do that in a way that's of benefit to everyone else. Well, that's a great deal. And it's very important to understand, at least to allow for the possibility that that's actually true. Like you guys have all left your zones of comfort and pursued your individual adventures. And, what's been the consequence of that? I mean, you have a huge fan base. You're obviously doing something that's useful for people. You seem to be having a good adventure. That's what you want to find. Mm-hmm. Musk found that. Elon Musk, I found that out when I interviewed him, because he had a real existential crisis when he was about 13. And he's very smart. So it was an intense crisis. And,
At 13?
13, yeah.
Jordan, do you think anything could be good forever?
It's a deep one.
And I mean, it's in the idea of
That's a deep one.
Because we constantly talk about someone, you're starting this new academy and you have great intentions. And we told the story about Abraham having you could have this, you learn this, you want to do good for yourself and for others, right? Do you think that is just innately what all humans are trying to accomplish? Or is it do people get to a point where they have so much that it's never enough, and then the change of hands to whoever comes next doesn't understand the values it took to get to that point, and then it's just now it's becoming, oh, what can I take from this, rather than how can I give to this and give to people? All these institutions that we talk about that are at a point where they've gotten to the point so far that they start to become corrupt. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to get at. Is it just a human thing that is a cycle that's never going to end? Or do you think someone could actually make something?
The first issue is, you might ask yourself, is do you want it to end? So there's an idea, again, in the biblical stories, there's a character, Jacob, who's really not a very good guy when he's a kid. He conspires with his mother to defraud his brother out of his rightful inheritance. He lies to his father. He's kind of a mama's boy. He's not a good guy, but he leaves. And when he leaves his home, partly because his brother wants to murder him, and for good reason, he makes a vow that he's going to change. And then he has a dream, and it's this famous dream of Jacob's ladder. And the dream is of a spiraling staircase, essentially, that ascends up into the infinite and has angels descending and ascending. That's Jacob's ladder. And when he wakes, he builds an altar and swears that he's going to transform. And so you asked, is there something that's eternally good? Well, in deep religious texts, there's an idea that you can live in the light of eternity, right? So you can live each moment as if it echoes in eternity. And that's, I suppose you get a sense of that whenever you're engaged in something that's particularly profound and meaningful. Maybe when you're deeply in love, when you're taking care of your children. There's a notion that you can bring eternity into each moment. Now, you asked, you put a complicated spin on that because you said something like, could that be permanent? And the permanency is probably in the process of transformation rather than in any particular thing that you do along the way. So you could think that as you're moving up Jacob's ladder towards something that's better and better, and you'll never hit the top, you could say, well, is there any given place along the way that's sufficient? And the answer is no, but the utility of that upward journey is sufficient. You know what I mean? So it's like engagement in a process. It's engagement in the proper process of upward striving that's permanent, even though it's permanent in that dynamic way, because you're a live thing, you're not static. And if that gets too constrained and becomes too static, then it tends to get corrupt.
Yeah.
I like
So
that.
so in the Abrahamic story, so what you see, it's very cool because Abraham decides that he's going to leave his zone of comfort and aim up. And then he has a series of adventures. And each adventure changes his character. He learns something, like he's at war at one point, and he has to go to a very corrupt city and try to redeem it. And he has a variety of very difficult adventures. And every time he has an adventure, he marks it with a sacrifice. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that as your character changes, because you've had a new adventure, you have to let go of things that characterized you in the past that are no longer suitable. And so Abraham, he changes so dramatically that he gets a new name in the text. And that's a reflection of the fact that if you spiral upward and you make the proper sacrifices, you can change so dramatically that it's like you're a different person. And then you might say, well, you want to do that all the time. You want to continue that process. Like, I've watched this. Like, I'm 62 now, and so I've lived quite a long time, and I've watched a lot of people, and I've seen this happen almost, what would you say, unavoidably. People tend to stultify at some age. The really unfortunate people peak in high school. And so 16 was the top point of their life. And everything after that's kind of an afterthought. And some people peak at 30, and some people peak at 40 and at 50. And most people are pretty static by the time they're 40. But it isn't inevitable, right? I mean, as you age, it's harder and harder to be dynamic and continue to transform, but it's still what you want to aim at.
What defines static? Like just bettering yourself?
Oh, just being stuck in
Content.
repetitive
Content.
repetition, I would say, and increasingly meaningless repetition. Loss of the sense of play, loss of exploration, loss of hope. Mm-hmm. That can go along with loss of health too. I mean, being in a state of endless upward transformation requires a fair bit of energy, and so you also have to be fortunate enough not to be visited by some catastrophic illness, although even then you can use that to transform. But it's very useful to know, to conceptualize your life that way, and it is innate in a way. I mean, people will pursue, well, thirst is innate and hunger is innate and lust is innate, but the force that integrates all of those and integrates that integration with other people, that's also innate. And that can make itself manifest as you spiral upward. And that's, I think, the feeling of meaningful engagement, like that actual experience, that embodied experience, is actually an indication that you're walking that path of upward transformation. That's how it's signaled to you instinctively.
Sounds like you're saying you got to continue to pursue new things and continue to change as a human as you get older.
Well, I think that that's where you derive your deepest source of meaning from. Like, it's not the only place, because you derive meaning, for example, from relationships, but they transform too. And a good relationship is something dynamic. Like, a good relationship is a transformational game. If you have a really good friend or a good marital partner, you're challenging each other constantly to continue to unfold and develop. And the meaning of the relationship then is allied with that proclivity to strive upward. And it is a challenge as well. And it's interesting to think about this. It's kind of obvious once you grasp it. So for example, if you have two teenagers and they want to play one-on-one basketball, you might say, well, the reason they're playing the game is to win. But if that was the case, each player would pick a play partner that they could just defeat 100% of the time. But no one does that. Like if you want to play a game that's fun and you have any sense, you actually try to find someone who's a little bit better than you are. So maybe you lose a little more often than you win. And you might say, well, why would you do that if winning is the point? And the answer is, well, winning is the proximal point of a single game, but the point of a sequence of games is to get better at playing. And so you're after the challenge.
On that idea, why do you think, you said something earlier about, I think you said, I don't know if it was the word attachment, but being stuck in places, like if we're talking about growing and, becoming better, why do you think it's so difficult for people to let go of the attachments that they have as far as like what their life should look like? A lot of times like leading into sort of depression or anxiety, like the idea of that my life should be this way, or my life was this way and I lost these things, and they hold on to that moment.
Yeah, kind of a sentimentality.
Yeah, within that, because like let's say they're in this moment trying to come up, but then they're latching and they're holding on to things that are keeping them kind of unpresent, like sort of in the past.
Yeah.
And then they're stuck with the feelings of anxiety in relationship to where they want to be, not where they are, and then depression holds on. How do you think a person could best remove themselves from attachments that hold them into places that make them feel?
Well, I have a practical solution to that. I can talk about that theoretically and practically. I mean, I developed a program 10 years ago, partly because of working as a professor and partly because of working as a clinical psychologist. And it was an attempt to address the issues that you just described. You can get locked into place, let's say, by failure of imagination. You don't have a vision for yourself. You can get locked into place because you don't think that there's any actions that you can take that will change things. So you have no belief in yourself as an active agent. You can get locked into place, this is a similar thing, because you believe that you're a victim of circumstances. You can get locked into place because at any moment it's easier to do nothing than to do something, right? So just inertia will keep you in place. You can get locked into place because you're surrounded by people who aren't supporting you when you move forward, because they punish you if you're good because it makes them look bad. And that's envy and jealousy, and that can be a very powerful constraining force for people. There are families that are constituted so that anytime anyone in the family ever does anything positive, everyone else punishes them. And so that's an awful situation. We developed this future authoring program to help people develop a vision for their life. And it uses some of the principles that we discussed earlier. So you need a vision for the future to motivate you to change, because it's easier to do nothing. So you need a reason to act. Okay, so now the question is, well, where might you discover a reason to act? So one of the things I could say, you're not going to be very good at that when you first try it. So maybe you have to do some rather simple exercises to get yourself warmed up. So I could say, all right, here's the game. It's what kids do when they pretend when they're kids. Okay, so here's the deal. 5 years down the road, you can have what you need and want. Okay, but here are the rules. You have to be treating yourself properly, as if you're valuable, and you have to specify what your goal is. Okay, so those are the only rules. Okay, so now we can translate that into initial action. So let yourself fantasize, and for 15 minutes, write down what you would want if you could have what you wanted 5 years down the road, who you would be. And you want to do this really like kids pretend. Who could you be if you could be who you wanted to be? What would that look like? You could think about people you admire and so forth. And so write for 15 minutes. And don't get picky about it, and don't get self-critical. Just get it out. Okay, next stage. Imagine that you let all your bad habits take the upper hand and control you, and that brought you to the worst place you could imagine in 5 years. What would that look like? Now that's useful, because to be motivated, two things have to happen. Something has to be chasing you, and you have to be chasing something. And you can get somewhere just by ambition, And you can get somewhere just by having fear push you, but you can really get somewhere if you're chasing something and you have fear pushing you. And so if you're trying to change the way you live and you think, well, I'm going somewhere better, but I'm also avoiding hell, then you're maximally motivated. Okay, so now you have those two competing visions. Where I could be if things went well, and where I could be if I let the weakest and most useless parts of me take the upper hand.
Do you write that one down too? The
write
worst
that
part?
one down too,
Both.
yeah, so you know, right? And so most people know, some people would, well, maybe, a woman would drift into prostitution, or you'd end up on the street, or you'd be a wondrul cocaine addict, or you'd be a terrible alcoholic, or you'd be a narcissist. I mean, who the hell knows? Or you'd be depressed or anxious. Like people fall, or hypochondriacal. People fall apart in their own ways, but everybody kind of has a sense of, where they drift if they let misery and nihilism take the upper hand. It's really useful to know that, because you need to know what you're trying to avoid and why. And then we ask people to make a more definitive vision. What should I do with my life? I don't know. Well, what do other people do with their lives? Do you have an intimate relationship? What's the quality of your friendships? Do you have a vision for your career? How are you going to educate yourself? How do you take care of yourself mentally and physically? What service do you offer other people? How do you regulate your worst habits? That's like 7 or 8 domains. You could have a vision for all of those. Your family, how would you put your family together if you made that a goal? My wife did an early version of this exercise 20 years ago. And one of her goals, when she was meditating on them, was to improve her relationships with her siblings and her father. And so she made that a target. And it worked radically well. Like she rectified all the, what would you call, the kind of leftover problems that she had with her family members, and established really positive relationships with them. But she'd made that a conscious goal. My sense of people is that we're basically visionaries that wrestle with possibility. That's the best way of conceptualizing us. That's what it means in some ways to be made in the image of God, because God in the Old Testament accounts, for example, is the force that wrestles with possibility and makes it into the order that's good. And that is what people do. That's what our consciousness does. But you have to have a vision.